This video is brought to you by Miclay, the innovative British fashion brand that donates a portion of its sales to charities that aim to improve our planet and environment. Find out more in the link below at www.miclay.co.uk. Thank you, Miclay. This is Australia, China's snack bar, Britain's former penal colony, and land home to around 48 million kangaroos. Meaning that if the kangaroos want the whole of the land down under to themselves, they'll have a numerical advantage. Anyway, Australia's economy is an interesting one, rich in natural resources, geographically isolated, and home to a domestic consumer base that's among the fastest growing within all the world's advanced economies. It's for these very reasons, and a few more, that Australia's economy had managed a 28-year period without an economic recession prior to COVID, and it has resulted in Australians being among the wealthiest citizens in the world. But how has a nation that some flat earthers claim doesn't exist become home to one of the most prosperous economies in the world? And where might its economy be heading? Well, in order to find out, we must first take a look at its history. Welcome to the economy of Australia. So, Australia's economy has changed significantly in the last 500 years, mainly as a result of its relative isolation to the other significant population centres around the globe. What is important to point out is that prior to the arrival of Europeans to the Australian continent, most Indigenous Australians were hunter-gatherers, and therefore in many ways the complex economies and societies that had developed amongst the estimated 750,000 Indigenous Australians differed significantly from the Dutch and British who rocked up in the 17th and 18th centuries. And the arrival of Europeans caused severe economic problems, as the infectious diseases that they brought, such as smallpox, reduced the labour force among indigenous communities. Once Europeans had officially begun settlements in the 18th century in modern-day Sydney, its economy was predominantly agriculturally based. Many sheep and cattle were brought to the settlement, and seal skins, whale oil, and whalebone were commodities that were exported. Now, as the decades went by, the colonial economy grew in complexity. In the 1820s, the production of wool was common, often exported to northwestern European countries. And in the 1830s, London-based banks set up in Australia, most notably the Bank of Australasia and the Union Bank of Australia. In the mid-19th century, a series of gold rushes swept through Australia that resulted in a greater influx of migrants to fill vacant positions. The state of Victoria, the centre of Australia's gold rush, saw its population increase from 76,000 to 540,000 in just 10 years. The growth in demand for labour was so intense that Victoria was considered to be the working man's paradise, with the stonemasons' union obtaining the 8-hour workday. At the time, this was unheard of, and some employers tried to undercut the unions by importing cheaper labour from China, which led to the White Australia policy, which, you might have guessed, restricted the entry of Chinese and other Asian immigrants in favour of white immigrants. Anyway, moving through the 20th century, many changes took place. The first national currency was introduced in 1910, the Australian pound, until it was replaced once again in 1966 with the Australian dollar. Also, a variety of goods other than wool became key components of Australia's exports, including wheat and dairy products. This took place in the 1920s and 1930s. By the 1960s, Australia began to lose the favourable access it had to the British markets under the imperial preference system, as a result of the British moving towards membership of the European Economic Community. This was a big blow for Australia, as Britain was a significant trading partner at the time. And in the mid-1980s, Australia's economy underwent a trade liberalisation phase, which, when coupled with growing demand in the soon-to-be superpower China, meant that Australia had found itself in a sweet spot that would help propel its economy forward. And that more or less takes us to where Australia's economy is today. So, what is Australia's economy like today? Has it maintained its status as one of the nations with the highest incomes globally? And just how far has its economic relationship with China developed? So, let's start with some data. Australia's economy is currently ranked as the 12th largest national economy in the world, almost $1.6 trillion in size. And with a population of almost 26 million, it means that Australia's GDP per capita is among the highest in the world, higher than Germany's, Canada's, and the UK's. Like most other advanced economies, Australia's economy today is primarily made up of the service sector. But unlike most advanced economies around the world, Australia has a giant mining sector that makes up almost 6% of the nation's GDP. In fact, its mining sector is a significant contributor to trade as well, with iron ores and concentrates and coal, the two most important components of Australia's exports, making up more than 30% of all the nation's exports. Just look at this graph and see for yourself just how important the mining industry is. So that's a brief look at what Australia's economy is like today. It's a high-income economy that has a developed service sector but also exports natural resources like a dictator propping up a regime. But what has allowed its economy to grow at such a rate to the point that it's now greater than half the size of the British economy? A development that has been underway for decades. What keeps the Southern Hemisphere's most advanced economy moving? So, one of the main factors that has been driving Australian economic growth is actually its population growth. You see, one of the many booms that is not always mentioned about Australia is the fact that its population has been growing at a rapid rate by advanced economies standards. Between 1980 and 2020, its population grew by an annual rate of 1.4%. For comparison, I've compiled the data of other advanced economies around the world so that you can see the difference here. This growth has actually meant that Australia's population has grown at a rate faster than London has, since the growth spurt the city has experienced since 2000. This growth has been a result of many immigrants arriving to Australia, so much so that 30% of Australia's population was born outside of the country, almost twice the rate seen in the United States of America. And more people means more houses need to be built, more teachers are needed to teach more children, and more mechanics will be needed to service the increasing numbers of vehicles on the growing amount of roads. But, of course, a growing population doesn't necessarily mean that per capita consumption will continue to rise, and that takes us to the other aspect that has been welcomed to Australia: Chinese demand. Okay, so China was extremely poor and now it's a middle-income country, with hundreds of millions of Chinese being pulled out of poverty. You all know the story. And Australia has seen its trade relationship with the Asian giant change from meh to anyway. You see, trade with China today represents 37% of all Australian trade. This is up from 1% in the late 1970s. And luckily for Australia, it is one of the few advanced economies that has a surplus with China to the tune of 58 billion Australian dollars, which is about 38 billion of the US kind. This economic relationship, coupled with consistent growth in Australia's population, are two of the reasons that allowed the country to avoid negative growth in the aftermath of the Great Recession. So, what can we expect from Australia's economy in the future? Will it continue this trend of relatively high economic growth? Will it remain the success story down under? the future outlook for the Australian economy is pretty good. We're likely to see a decrease in Chinese demand for raw materials in the coming decades, as its economy continues its transition towards a more domestic consumer-driven economy, but demand will remain nonetheless. And other countries are hoped to pick up part of China's demand for raw materials, most notably India and nearby Indonesia, home to a combined population greater than 1.6 billion people and an economy of $4 trillion, which continues to grow reliably more than 5% annually. On a demographic front, Australia has a younger workforce than other developed countries, and it is aging at a slower rate, in part due to its higher rate of inward migration. As such, it's expected to be able to delay the pressures that other developed economies will and are experiencing with their aging populations. So, brownie points for the Australian economy. But there is of course certain areas that will cause disruption to Australian economic growth, that will see the economy having to innovate and adapt. To begin with, climate change will cause even more problems to the land of kangaroos, and in more than one way. For starters, Australia has that really big mining industry we mentioned earlier, and although demand for natural resources will persist, the thought of coal representing a sizable portion of Australia's exports to the world will not continue without a fight from those concerned about its contribution to climate change. And despite its large landmass, Australia may find itself increasingly involved with climate refugees. Not just from the many small countries that have islands scattered across the Pacific, but also much more populated nations like Indonesia and the Philippines, who will also suffer severely from the effects of climate change, but with fewer capabilities to reduce the impact. And these possible future events may cause regional instability, something that often hinders economic growth. So there you go. Australia's economy, in a way, is much like Texas's, but down under, and with fewer guns. It experiences rapid economic growth supported by natural resources and a lot of migration. Fundamentally, it's a solid and well-functioning economy that I have no doubt will continue to remain prosperous into the future. Hello everyone, thank you for watching today's video. If you want to support the channel, then hit that like button and subscribe and share this video with your friend who lives closest to Australia. Or if you live in Australia, let us know whereabouts you're from. It's a pretty big country you've got there. Anyway, I'll see you in the next video. Take care. Bye.